Alright, welcome everyone to the Theosophical Society Point Loma. It is actually a special day today because it is the anniversary of the Theosophical Society, and not only just an anniversary, but the 144th anniversary, so 12 cycles of 12 years. So really a special day. If you are here for the first time, this whole lecture is about what is exactly Theosophy, what is the Theosophical Society, so we will get in there. This lecture is in two parts, so about half an hour each part, and we have ample time for questions in between. But if you also have in between things are unclear, it's no problem, just ask. All right, universal wisdom. I think that every one of us once in his life or her life has the intuition that there must be something like a universal wisdom. Something like a knowledge, not the common knowledge, the knowledge you find in books or in libraries, but a knowledge that can teach you more about life, how to answer the questions in life, some ethical knowledge, what to do with problems you have in life, and also really a universal wisdom that which is also we can say is good, that also applies to what we think, to our morals, what we think in our heart is true, not only our mind. And when you have this intuition, you probably go searching. And it's obvious to search into religion, into philosophy, and into science. And the thing that you then find out is that more than often, these different areas of knowledge are contradicting each other. And you can ask yourself, how is this possible? Because if there's truth, well, either one is true or the other, or there must be a greater truth that transcends them. And then we come back again to this idea of a universal wisdom. Well, this lecture is intended to show that such a universal wisdom exists. And also we will go into what its core ideas are. So especially if you are here for the first time, I think this is a very good introduction to this universal wisdom. But for those who are already familiar with universal wisdom or theosophy, one of its names, it is also good to ponder over the question, why is this wisdom universal? What does that mean? And what does it mean to have knowledge of this wisdom, be it a lot or just a little? The second objective that we have for this lecture is to show that religion, philosophy, and science are all three facets of this universal wisdom. And also we will discuss about how they relate to universal wisdom. And the third goal we have with this lecture is to show you how you can recognize and also apply this universal wisdom in your own life, because that's actually where the real proof lies. We will also get into this idea of proof, because something can be very elaborate and convincing from, well, just the outer looks, but the real proof is, can you just apply it in your daily life? Can you really test its worth in your daily life? So these are some questions we will try to answer. What is universal? If we talk about universal wisdom, and of course, what is wisdom? And these together, what is universal wisdom? And we will show you some of the principles of the universal wisdom. We, of course, will also talk about religion, philosophy, and science from the perspective of universal wisdom. We will also talk about where does this universal wisdom come from. And what I already explained, we will also say something about what does it mean in practice. But maybe it's important also to start with the main message that we want to convey this afternoon. Because when we talk about religion, philosophy, science, it might sound a bit far away, a bit abstract, these terms. But when it comes to universal wisdom, you really don't have to look for it outside yourself. We all carry it with us. And it's rather a process of awakening something in yourself, to really awaken the scientific, the philosophical, and the religious part in yourself, because it's part of yourself. And we think everyone can do that. So don't worry about that we will go into all these details about religions and science and philosophies. It's just something you can also find that in yourself. All right, let's start. What is universal? Well, I've collected some of my direct associations with this word, universal. And the first thing that came in my mind was a plug. I think it's really nice that you can just move around, and wherever you are, you can just find a power outlet and then plug in your devices and everything works. I think we take it for granted most of the times, but it's very nice that it works that way. But it's not always the case. I was in the United States this summer, and then I found out, okay, it's not that universal. You need some extra pieces of technology to make it work. And you see directly the difficulty of really creating something universal. I think in mathematics we succeeded a bit more. I think it's really cool that we have a language that is really spoken throughout the world. Everyone can understand each other using these basic principles. You only have a few principles, a few axioms you have to follow, and then everyone all over the world can understand you by this language of mathematics. And the other thing is that universal also reminds us of the word universe. And it's interesting if you look at the etymology of this word universe. It comes from the Latin. It's based on two words. One is unus, that means one, or unity. And the other is the verb vertere, which means to revolve. So a universe literally means revolving around unity, or all in one, or relating to the whole, or to unity. So if you go take this to the etymology of the word universal, it means literally something as fitting within unity, or something that is in harmony with the whole. But most of the time, I think we understand it as something that can be applied anywhere, anytime, in all areas, you could say. So now let's go to the next question. What is wisdom? And there it's also interesting to look at the etymology first. It comes from the Indo-European root wit or weit, which means to see. And you can also recognize this in the word vision, coming from the same root. And another derivation is from the Sanskrit root Veda, which means knowing. So you could say that wisdom is something like having a vision, inner knowledge, or seeing the truth. And the definition we propose for this lecture is that wisdom is the conscious application of truth. And I will explain that further. First of all, application. Because if you really have insight into something, you will automatically apply it. Just like a real carpenter, he has this carpenter's eye, his eye for detail, and he cannot turn that off. He always takes that with him. He cannot, he just is this carpenter's profession. And that's also why Plato says that truly knowing something equals being something. If we really know something, we have become it. We really live it. So our behavior really shows our wisdom. And there's also an American writer and philosopher, Thoreau, and he also says it in this way. He says, the title wise is for the most part misused. How can a person be a wise man if he does not know how to live a better life than others? If he is only more cunning and intellectually more subtle. So he says, if you're really wise, then you have to have better answers about what is really life about. So being wise is living wise, you could say. And secondly, we talk about the conscious application of truth. We talk about truth because wisdom can also be seen as almost synonymous with truth. Because you can ask yourself, can applying something that is not true really be wise? And I think each of us can probably give many examples of that things we have done according to the best knowledge of a certain moment at that time, later on appear to be unwise because, in the light of our current knowledge, it wasn't really, reality, real truth, as we now understand it. But then we also have to really follow this definition, the conscious application of truth. We also have to define what is truth then. So let us think about this first with our common sense. Hello, welcome. So what is truth? You could say that truth cannot be anything else than reality. And if we think of reality, that's something that really extends infinitely far. It's not only what takes place right now, here in this lecture room in The Hague, but you could say that what happens right now in a galaxy far away, in one of the planets at one of the billions of stars in that galaxy, what happens there at this moment is also part of that same reality. Or if we think of the other way around, if we think of all the connections that right now are being made in the molecules that compose the cells of our bodies, that everything is now moving around and connections are broken and reconnected, that is also part of the same reality. And then we're only talking about this little cross-section of things that we have perceived, that we know of. We know a bit of how infinite, how boundless this universe is. We know a bit of the micro processes going on in our bodies. And that is all part of this reality. But you could say that there is much more, of course, that we haven't perceived yet. You could say there is an infinity of all potential frequencies that are penetrating each other, that are interblending. And that's all part of the same reality. Everything that is now going on in these few seconds. And we directly understand that we cannot perceive this all. It's impossible. That is so broad and so wide, and we can only see just a little cross-section of this. So you could say that this is truth with capitals. This idea of the boundless reality. Everything that takes place right now at the current moment. But that's normally not what we speak of when we use the word truth. When we say something is true, we refer to something else. And you could say that what we understand as truth is actually what is the most universal vision, the most universal understanding that we have of this boundless reality, and that we can experience, that we can test independently, and that we can share with each other. And, there are of course many examples of this. The fact that Saturn has rings, for example, or that the globe is, that the Earth is a globe, or that water is liquid. It's all a lot of things that we have experienced. We can also test, we can share this with each other. So this is really what we talk mostly about when we talk about truth. But it's good to understand that it's only, a relative thing. And then you have something that we can call my truth, which also actually is the same as a certain opinion or belief. What I hold true, what I perceive, what is my reality. We sometimes say, well, my city or my village is the most beautiful in the world. Well, that's of course just an opinion. That's only my reality. From my perspective, that is true maybe. Or that my wife's the sweetest, or my children are the smartest, all those kinds of expressions. It's what I hold true, it's my reality. And actually these three levels of truth are very clearly illustrated with this Buddhist story, maybe you might know it, of the blind monks who are describing the elephant. And one has its tail, calls it a rope. The other has its trunk, calls it a snake. The other has a leg, describes it as a tree trunk. And just like the blind monks, we can also come to a broader truth by sharing our experiences and having them tested. Okay, come here and feel. This is also part of the elephant. Hey, okay, that's something different. So we get to a larger picture. And no matter how big the elephant is that we investigate, it always remains just a limited part of that completely limitless reality. So we can get a broader and broader image, but it's always just a relative truth, part of that, you say, boundless infinity. So back to the definition, because we talked about this idea of truth, because we tried to define wisdom, and we said wisdom is the conscious application of truth. And now we said, okay, truth, what we can understand as truth, is this most universal vision we can come up with of this boundless reality that we can experience, that we can test independently from each other, and that we can share. Okay, now let's go to universal wisdom. And this idea of universal wisdom you can find in a lot of traditions. Actually, all the old traditions, old world philosophy talk about this in different words. And it's also been called the wisdom religion, for instance, or esoteric philosophy, or occult science. And you can see already that you can call it both a religion, you can call it a philosophy, you can also call it a science. And it's also defined as a synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. And synthesis doesn't mean like an assembly, we just do cherry picking, a bit from religion, a bit from philosophy, a bit from science. No, it really means that there is a core of wisdom, a main source, a shared source from which all these three flow. Religion flows from it, philosophy and science. And another name for this universal wisdom is Theosophia, which means divine wisdom, or wisdom of the gods. And you can find this word already in the beginning of our era, of our, how do you say, our, tijdrekening. So in the Neoplatonists, for instance, in Alexandria, at the start of our era, they already used this word, Theosophia, the divine wisdom, wisdom of the gods. And with divine or with gods is not meant that it's something outside of us, because the divine is also within us. We will come back to that later. But it means that it's above our human limits, above our human level of understanding. It's really the highest, the universal, above personal wisdom. But it is universal, so that means it relates to the whole just as much as to ourselves as a part of the whole. So that means that we can also discover it, awaken it in ourselves. And therefore it's also sometimes called transcendental. It's beyond our limited being, but we can also try to transcend ourselves beyond that and get a more insight in this wisdom. Another name is secret doctrine, and there you get the idea of secrecy. You often see that in tradition, secrecy or mysticism, we say, or esotericism, as in esoteric philosophy. And that idea of secrecy or esotericism refers to two things. Firstly, that there is an inner knowing, something we have to awaken in ourselves, unveil in ourselves, and that we can achieve that through independent truth finding. And it's also sometimes called the heart doctrine. It also points to something within ourselves. But it also refers to something else, this idea of esoteric. And then you have the distinction between esoteric and exoteric. And that word comes also from the Greek, meaning belonging to the inner circle, or more inwardly. And it refers to the more hidden or secret side of the teachings that you can find in every tradition. And so you have many teachers, such as Buddha, or such as Jesus, or such as Ammonius Saccas, the Neoplatonists. They never wrote anything. All we know of them is by, later on, described by their pupils. But they all had a small circle of students that they personally taught. And that's education that went beyond what we later know of the exoteric side, the thing that was written down in the holy books and that was passed on by churches and institutions like that, religious institutions. They all had an esoteric teaching that went further than what was exoterically known. And you see that every world religion has such an esoteric line. If you think of Islam, for instance, you have Sufism. In Judaism, you have the Kabbalah. In ancient Greece, you had the mysteries. In Hinduism, the Upanishads. The esoteric side is represented by the Mahayana tradition in Buddhism. And in Christianity, you had Gnosticism. Now, what does this esoteric doctrine consist of? So every world religion has this esoteric line, and if you study these esoteric lines of all these traditions, you will find out that there is really a shared universal teaching or wisdom that you can discover in each of these philosophies and religions. And they all point to this universal esoteric doctrine or universal wisdom. And actually that is what Madame Blavatsky, when she founded the Theosophical Society, really did, to show that you can find this universal doctrine, this universal wisdom in all these different traditions, in all these philosophies, in all these religions. And actually her main book, The Secret Doctrine, is nothing else than all these traditions combined, and showing that there are really only really a few principles that you can find in each of these traditions. And she also describes them in The Secret Doctrine as the three fundamental propositions. So these are three ideas, and you can really see that it's like a red thread going through all these philosophies, all these religions, if you take a look at the esoteric side of it. Well, we'll also tell you some more about these fundamental propositions, because they also link to this idea of religion, philosophy, and science. And these are the fundamental propositions in short. If you want to have the whole of them, I will show you a bit of how they were worded by Blavatsky, but they're also in our yellow folder if you want to know more. Boundlessness, cyclicity, the second, and the third has actually more ideas that all cohere with each other. it's talked about the fundamental identity of all life and self-directed evolution. And the idea is that there is always life within life, and that there is a correspondence, as above, so below. So all the processes that we can, well, see in the large, we can also discover the same in the small, and then there are these repetitions, these correspondences. Well, we will look into each of these, and before the break, especially the first one, boundlessness. And this is the way Blavatsky worded it in the Secret Doctrine. She talks about an omnipresent, eternal, boundless and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. One absolute reality which antecedes all manifested conditioned being. And this is actually in line with what we have said before about truth in capital letters. It is really the boundless reality. It can never be comprehended in full, but it's a very important idea to start from. Because if you really take this idea, you can really, I will show you later, discover this in all these traditions, in all these religions. But if you really take the philosophical idea of this truth with capitals, it immediately prevents all dogma. Because according to boundlessness, nobody can really claim to know the absolute truth of everything. All we can know is just, we have is a relative idea about this truth. I think that's a very important idea. Now, you can find this in all religions and philosophies, but in different words or different metaphors they also use. Because, well, we already discussed it's beyond human conception, so sometimes you can only point to it with a metaphor. In Judaism, in the Kabbalah, they talk about Ein Sof, which also really literally means without boundaries. And that is also, you find in the Greek, with the Greek philosophers talking about apeiron, boundlessness. And in the Taoism, they speak of it as the unspeakable. The real Tao cannot be named. You really cannot describe it. It really doesn't have any characteristics. It's not untangible. It's not tangible. It's unspeakable. Hinduism says it's just basically it, Tat. Islam says it's the all. Buddhism says it's empty, empty of characteristics. You cannot grab it. And this idea of emptiness or death or space or the deep, you can find also in different traditions. No properties, no dimensions, but it includes everything still. Well, if you take a look from science, that's actually the same idea. We haven't, from what we have observed, from what we understand, we know no better than that there is infinity, that there is limitless, both in the large and the small. So this famous picture from the Hubble telescope. It's called I think the ultra deep field. It's one of the directions in which we can really look very far, billions of light years away. And then we still see a lot of black in this picture, and we really haven't found a boundary. We haven't found any limits to the universe. And on the right, there's a picture of the smallest we have photographed. That's the atom. But we know, of course, from all our experiments with these particle accelerators, like in CERN, for instance, that the atom can still be divided into countless smaller particles, and every time our technique gets better, we discover new, even smaller particles. And we can even hardly call it particles. They are also can be called energies or forces, really without dimensions. And if we take some more philosophical view on this idea of boundlessness, a philosophical approach. Some conclusions you can draw is that if we take this idea of boundlessness as a starting point, then all life, and that's usually also described with different metaphors, is really a spark of this boundless fire, or a ray of this boundless light, or a drop of the endless ocean. And in philosophy, for instance, the philosopher Leibniz speaks, as also did Pythagoras and Neoplatonists, of the monad. He calls it a monad. He says it's a mathematical point of consciousness, of this boundless consciousness, with its center nowhere and its circumference everywhere. So that means that all life, in essence, is immortal, has an immortal core, has also boundless powers, and because every part of the boundless, like ourselves, cannot be other also than boundless. I mean, the boundless is everywhere, so it is also in all its parts, and that it means that everything is this boundless in essence, and that everything, also the parts, like us, have this boundless capabilities in essence. And that means that also through self-knowledge we are able to know this boundless whole. And I think that is maybe even the biggest lesson. We already shared that we don't have to look elsewhere. We don't have to search this infinite universe. We don't have to break up, use these particle accelerators to find out what is really the essence of life. And we don't have to pray to gods or to wait for life after death to find out and get insight into reality. We already are it. We just swim it. It's everywhere, and we can find it, this universal wisdom in ourselves. And I think a very important other conclusion, a very ethical conclusion, of course, is that everything is one. There is unity. So there is absolute interconnectedness of everything. We are in essence the same. And actually that's also the same that religion refers to, the really meaning of religion. If you take also there, you take a look at the origin of the word, it really literally means reunification, religare, or identification. Actually, that's one derivation, and the other is relegendo, that comes from the Roman Cicero, and he says that means, literally means to choose again, or to select again, or to read again. And he explains it that it means that you keep focusing on living the life according to your highest ideals, to your highest selection, you could say. It's like, actually the word discipline describes it really well. Seeing the unity of life all the time and trying to apply that to live according to it. And then we come back also to Plato's statement that really knowing something equals being something. And if you have become something, then you really know it. And just like a professional is just not a professional from 9 to 5, but he is just, still like that when he comes home, when he has a weekend, and actually he really, just breathes that, you could say. And actually that is also what the definition of Theosophist is. And we don't mean that people that are a member of a Theosophical society, but really, the essential meaning of Theosophist that Blavatsky describes in her book, The Key to Theosophy. She says Theosophist is who Theosophy does, and that is someone who has this vision of this unity of all life and tries to act accordingly, to it, and try to bring that into practice. And we can all do that according to our highest picture of this unity. So those are some things I talked about universal wisdom. So what is universal, what is wisdom, what is universal wisdom? And one of the first principles, the other two we can discuss after the break, and also see how they relate to philosophy and also to science. All right, are there any questions? Yes.
I was thinking that, well, when I'm looking at the news and I see the troubles that the people, the humanity, we surrounded in, and now I want to find a solution for those problems so I can focus on religion, science, and philosophy. The aspect. But can you tell me something a little bit more in how to? Because now I feel for me, if I put it in that way, it feels a little bit difficult to think. Okay, now there is a universal wisdom, so it can be solved.
But that's already a very important first big step, of course.
Yeah.
If you see a daily life, people that don't start with that assumption, only if it is just an assumption, but the assumption that there is such a universal knowledge, and then you won't lose your hope or your your expectation to come to answers. And that is already something that it's very, I mean, that in itself shows even scientifically that it works. And that we think of, okay, there is an answer to it. I'm not there, it's not hopeless or anything. So that's already a important first step. After the break, we will also go into more about how to recognize the philosophical and the religious and the scientific within yourself. We cannot fit in everything, of course, within a short span of time. So I hope that then it becomes more clear. And maybe secondly, if you, I try to show how universal this, from religion, at least the standpoint of religion, how universal this idea of unity is. And I think that is also something that is very practical. And of course, we say there's nothing more practical than ideas, but the real practice is then for each of us to try to recognize those ideas and to discover and bring them into practice, etc. So, and then, you cannot do that for someone else, but I think that the standpoint from that everything is united, that there is oneness, already makes clear so much and already helps so much in the way we behave and also our own approach or mindset in life. How there are many people who just only focus on their personal well-being, and that also gets them into trouble a lot of times, because they're very focused on themselves. And if they say, okay, I'm just one of the nodes in this endless network, and it's all interconnected, that's a very different approach. So maybe those are some ideas. Or is there something really practical you're thinking right now? How does that apply?
Well, I was thinking sort of about the bio-industry, I guess, or for example, it's so, it's not in one moment to solve that. So then I think, okay, when I put the universal wisdom next to it, I laid and then I think, okay, now how can I look at it in a philosophical way, or a religional way, and a scientific way?
That's a very good question. And of course, if we take a look at what is happening right now, there's this huge gap, of course. I mean, from these ideas to what we really do in practice. And I think that, of course, all change starts with ourselves. We can think about this. We can think about, if we talk about, for instance, the bio industry. Let's go back to one of these slides. The idea that everything is a spark of this boundless life. If you recognize this in all living beings, so you know that pigs, chickens, whatever, they are also we actually, this idea of fundamental identity, we're really identical in essence with them. They have these same potential capabilities. It might take a little longer, but in essence they have the same potential. And that means for ourselves, for instance, we can draw some conclusions about it. Okay, what do we do if we don't want to support this bio industry? What choices do we make in the food we eat, in the groceries we do, in our shopping? That start with us. And well, maybe that's even the better. Plato said, really knowing something is being something. That's most of the times the best way to show it to others, just by your behavior. So if you do behave like that, and I see it's really fun. At my work we share our lunch. So we just order at Albert Heijn every week, and then all the lunch comes in, and together we can just ask for, okay, I like to have this for lunch and I like to have that. So me and a couple of colleagues started to ask for this vegetarian sausage. So we get vegetarian sausage, and we get all these colleagues, hey, okay, oh, this doesn't taste bad. Okay, what's actually good to have this sausage, etc. And then you can see the idea spreads. Now we have every week, we have as much as vegetarian sausage as the other sausage. So I think that's it's really little progress, of course, but it is progress. So although there might sometimes be this gap, I think that's more or less the way to go. Just little steps, and we have eternity, so we shouldn't be too impatient. Okay. No other questions? Then let's have a break. All right, as I promised, we will talk about religion. We have talked about religion. We'll talk about philosophy and science. Where does universal wisdom come from, and universal wisdom in practice? Already discussed some ideas about this. But to start with, we want to tell you something about this allegory of Plato, which is also known as Plato's cave. And the story also describes how we can see reality, or how we can see truth, and thus develop wisdom. And we also start our course thinking differently with this metaphor. It's a metaphor for human thinking that he uses in his dialogue about the state, or politeia. And Plato says that the mind of the average person is, as it were, like that of people chained in a cave. So here you see some people sitting in this cave, and the fire is burning behind them. They are chained here, and there is a fire behind them, and in between them and the fire there is a road, and people walk across the road carrying all kinds of obstacles. And all the everything that these prisoners perceive is the shadows of the objects that are carried along that road. And for them, that is life. And so when the people that carry those objects are talking, for them it is as if these shadows are talking. and they can recognize all kinds of patterns in the coming and going of these shadows. And actually they're building a complete science, a complete philosophy, a complete religion around this appearance and disappearance of these shadows on the wall, on the back of the wall of the cave. Now Plato asks, what would happen if we are freeing such a prisoner, unchaining them, and forcing them to leave the cave? And first, then the prisoner will come to the fire, and he would probably be completely blinded by the light, because he was always living in the shade. And slowly his eyes would get adjusted to the light of the fire, and then he suddenly discovers these objects that are carried and passing by. And he first wouldn't recognize exactly what he sees, because he wants to go back, to return to what he knows, these shadows. But then he realizes that what he sees is really much more real than the shadows that he always considered as real. And what would happen, Plato asks, if we carry him further out of the cave and bring him outside the cave? And probably a similar process would take place. His eyes would be blinded by the light of the sun. He cannot bear this light. And at first he can only perceive things in twilight. And and then slowly, after a while, his eyes will get used to the light, and he will be able to perceive the world and all living beings there in its fullness. And then he also will realize that what he sees is much, much more real than what he before perceived that was true or reality. And then he will try to look for the origin of everything he sees. And he then sees that the sun is the source that makes everything visible. But if he wants to see this, he is blinded again and realizes that he cannot look any further. And at some point he thinks about his fellow prisoners in the cave, and still feeling connected with them, the desire in him grows to tell them about the reality of the world outside the cave. But when he returns, his eyes will have to be adjusted to the dark again. So he sees nothing, he does not recognize these shadows, and therefore his fellow prisoners think that he has gone crazy and do not take him seriously when he tells them about the world outside the cave. And even, Plato says, if he continues to persuade them about his ideas, they will eventually try to kill him. Now, why this story about the cave? Well, among other things, because if we talk about this universal wisdom, we can add something to what we said before. Namely, that it is that wisdom whose universality has already been proven. Now, you may say, okay, we discussed before that wisdom can be defined as the conscious application of the most universal vision that we can have of this boundless reality, and that we can experience, that we can test, and that we can share independently. And now we say that universal wisdom is wisdom that has already been proven. So how can this be, you might ask? We haven't yet experienced it, we cannot test it yet, we cannot share it yet. Well, still we say, okay, there is this wisdom that has already been proven, because it is only a matter of time for us to experience it, to test it, to share it, because there were already so many people who have done so, who have already experienced it, who have tested it, who have shared it time and again, that they have this conviction that we can do it as well. And like someone who has been outside of the cave knows that it is the potential of anyone to experience that reality. The only thing he has to do is to unchain himself, to free himself from the chains and go outside. And then he knows for himself. So in the same way, there are these people that have already got this image of this universal wisdom, that it exists, they have tested it, they have experienced it, they have shared it with others, and they know, okay, this is also our potential. And that means that we don't have to examine everything from the start. We don't have to look into all details, to everything that science or philosophies or religions say. No, we can try to go to this core universal wisdom and use that as a starting point. And then we don't have to look for it and find out. Well, we have to find out, of course, because we have to still experience it and test it for ourselves. Otherwise, we cannot talk about it as something that it is our wisdom. And it also can take quite a while to do so. And it also requires some work to do so, especially because it is an inner process. But it is there. And there are many, many directions pointing to it. And connected with that is also the idea of how can we prove something? This idea of, okay, if there is universal wisdom, how can we prove that it's true? And that's really also something important to talk about if we say that there is a wisdom whose universality has already been proven. So what is then proof? Now we are most of the time talking about evidence or proof as something that comes from outside. And that if we say we hear something we haven't heard before, we say, okay, prove it to me. We say, okay, come, and then we think, okay, just show me a picture or a video or come up with some document and then it's proven. But of course it doesn't work that way. Actual evidence never comes from outside. It always is a sort of conviction that comes from within. And suppose, for instance, that someone has a mathematical proof of something. We really cannot check that if we haven't learned any mathematics, if we don't even know how to make a formula. We first have to work on ourselves, understand something, build up some inner understanding to understand this proof from a mathematical point of view. And the same applies, for instance, if we talk about religion or philosophy. If you have never read a religious text or a philosophical text, and we all know this, you have to really study this and think it over, and it just takes some time to really get to the depth of such a text. So you can say that you can only know and prove what you really are. Again, this idea of truly knowing something is being something, and then that it also means that to get to know the universal, this universal wisdom, we also have to become universal. We have to also find this universality within ourselves. But everything is already in us. It's only a matter of time to evolve this. And we say this with conviction because it is also completely in line with how we see man, with how we see ourselves as actually a part of this boundless. So let's go into that a bit more to make it more understandable. So we talked about this idea of the boundless, and we said already that every being, every consciousness, including ourselves as humans, can be seen as a spark or a drop or a stream, you could also say, of this boundless consciousness. And you can distinguish different principles within this stream of consciousness. So there are religions that make a threefold distinction, a fourfold, a fivefold. We use a sevenfold distinction. We say there is something like a divine or universal principle within every consciousness. And in Sanskrit, it's called the Atman. Then you have an enlightening principle, called the buddhi. You have the thinking, the manas. You have desire, kama. You have life energy, prana. You have the astral. And then you have what we can perceive with our senses, the physical. And each being is developing these principles. And actually, we as humankind are now developing the thinking principle or the manas principle. And we can make this more understandable by also dividing this thinking principle in 7 thinking aspects that correspond to these 7 principles. And now it becomes more clear because we can just recognize this in our daily life. And actually our course, Thinking Differently, is we learn this in much more time and discuss this with each other, how to recognize this and how to use these ideas. So we have 7 thinking aspects. To start from the bottom, physical thinking is when we say I'm hungry or thirsty or tired. Feelings, being scared, being angry, being happy. Vitality, that's when we want to do things, when we cannot sit still, when we have to constantly think of what do we have to do today, making to-do lists, checking them, etc. Desire, well, that speaks almost for itself, wanting to possess things, not only material, but also things like results or honor or status. The intellect, the 2 + 2 = 4 principle, very good at structuring, at reasoning, organizing. Not so good at seeing the bigger picture, to recognize coherence, that's the next principle, the insight or understanding. And imagination and idealism are also part of that thinking aspect. And finally, the sense of unity. And that is a thinking aspect that is not yet very active for the average person. It's those rare mystical experiences that are described by, for instance, the founders of world religions. And then they speak of enlightenment or moksha or satori or epiphany or inspiration, whatever they call it. And that can hardly really be expressed in words and is often used only described in metaphors. Now, why is it important to reflect on these thinking aspects in relation to religion, philosophy, and science? Because actually, science, philosophy, and religion correspond to the 3 higher thinking aspects. And now it becomes clear why this really is something that we carry within us, that is part of ourselves. It is not something that is existing outside of us. We can recognize the philosophical, the scientific, and religion in ourselves. And in the light of universal wisdom, these 3 ways to find knowledge, to get insight into reality, cannot be separated. They overlap. And the one focuses more on the question, how do things work? Philosophy more on the why of things, and religion more on the what for, or to what end are things existing. And we have said before that universal wisdom is that wisdom of which the universality has already been proven, and that if we want ourselves to know the universal and prove it, that it must live in us. And you could also say that the scientific, the philosophical, and religious thinking are all necessary for getting to proof or getting to evidence. It is, they help us to rise above belief, and that's more the plane of the lower 4 thinking principles. To let go of our opinions to what we on first sight believe is true, and that we sometimes personally attach to. We see often our way of looking as a kind of possession. We don't want to lose it. We would rather not ask questions about it, because then it means that we have to question our knowledge, and then everything starts to move. But it also means that if we stay in this more personal idea of truth, my truth, then our knowledge will not grow. Our wisdom will not grow. And if on the other hand we use our intellect, we use our insight, and we use our sense of unity, then we always see that knowledge can deepen, that wisdom can broaden. So these three ways to discover more about reality helps us to get to wisdom. And back to this idea of proof, you could also say that proof is an agreement of the religious, philosophical, and scientific thinking within ourselves. If one of the aspects is not satisfied, one of our thinking aspects is not convinced, something can make sense in a rational way, for instance, in a scientific way, but if it doesn't speak to our heart, if it doesn't speak to our conscience, we still will not regard it as true. And it's the other way around as well. We can have a certain moral conviction, but if we cannot underpin this with reason, then things can start to float when we are in discussion with others, when they are questioning our beliefs. So you could also say that, actually that's more precise, that all these thinking aspects, these 7 aspects, have to be in harmony from the highest to the lowest to say that something is true. And that's also something that's very central to Theosophy, this idea of independent thinking, coming to conviction yourself. And you can see that from the first moment of the history of the Theosophical Society. And I think that's also good to stress a bit, because that also tells us where these ideas come from. As I already told, the Theosophical Society was founded in 1875, actually 144 years ago, exactly this day. And it was founded by this lady, Madame Blavatsky, a Russian lady born in Yekaterinoslav, at that time Russia, now it's in Ukraine. And she lived from 1831 till 1891. And from really early on, from her childhood, she had certain intuitions about this universal wisdom. She knew that there had to be more wisdom, started also traveling when she was very young, 18 years old. And at the age of 24, she met her teacher, whom she recognized from her childhood dreams, and went together with this teacher also to Tibet, where she studied for 3 years. And then by the order of her teachers, in 1875, she founded the Theosophical Society in New York. Together with these 2 gentlemen, William Quan George on the left and Henry Steele Olcott on the right. With the goals forming a nucleus of universal brotherhood. First, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy and science. And thirdly, to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. With the motto, there is no religion higher than truth. And soon after the founding, Theosophy spread around the world, and many centers and lodges were formed worldwide. In 1877, she published her first book, Isis Unveiled, which was sold out within a few days. And in 1888, her masterpiece, The Secret Doctrine, was published, with as subtitle, A Synthesis of Science, Religion and Philosophy. And as we already told, it reveals more of the universal wisdom openly at that time than ever done before in human history. She shows the similarity of ideas in especially the esoteric side of all these religions, philosophies, and in the world, and also connected to the science of that time. It's still an inexhaustible source of inspiration for many. Many have corroborated the statements that were made in the book, especially if you think about it was 1888. So that was before the discoveries of radioactivity, for instance, by Curie and by Röntgen and Becquerel. And in the book she already talks about matter and spirit as being essentially the same, long before Einstein came up with this formula where he says that matter and energy are the same things. And so still many more things are waiting for discovery. But it's interesting to see where science stands now with ideas of the cyclic coming and going of life, etc. And discovering how boundless our universe is, things like that. She introduces there this idea of Theosophia, this universal wisdom religion that has always existed. And for a large part of history was as well as scientific, philosophical, and religious, and which was first conveyed by the beings who were further than us in their development of consciousness. We sometimes call them gods, we can call them devas, buddhas, Dianchoans, whatever. And they were handed over to the predecessors of the human race. We can think, for instance, of the myth of Prometheus that stole the fire from the gods. It really is symbolic for the intellectual, the thinking principle that was awakened in humanity. And we can also find these idea of predecessors or forerunners in all these traditions. They are called adepts or mahatmas or rishis or bodhisattvas. And actually they work together in what is also called the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, that is sending messengers at certain cycles of time who are all the time exposing the core of this universal wisdom specified for that culture and in that language for that moment. And then we can think of like Krishna or Buddha, Zarathustra, Jesus, Lao Tse, Plato, Pico della Mirandola, who was one of these pupils who's by the order of his teachers was one of the inspirations for the Renaissance in Europe to start, and Blavatsky also, which one of the later messengers. So it might sound a bit magical about these beings that are further than us in development of consciousness, but it's also a very natural conclusion if we start to reason from these principles, that there is this boundless possibility of evolving further, and that are people that are just further than us in their development. And you can also see that that they always point to the boundless wisdom that is in ourselves, that must be awakened in ourselves. So these messengers never say, okay, this is how it is. They just give some clues that we have to work with ourselves. And Blavatsky beautifully describes this in her book Isis Unveiled. She says, tell one who had never seen water that there is an ocean of water, and he must accept it on faith or reject it altogether. But let one drop fall upon his hand, and then he has a fact from which all the rest may be inferred. After that he could by degrees understand that a boundless and fathomless ocean of water existed. Blind faith would no longer be necessary. He would have supplanted it with knowledge. And that's also what Blavatsky did, like all these messengers, just lifted only a small tip of the veil that had been cast over this hidden or secret wisdom for centuries. And then with one drop, you could say, of the teachings that she gave, teachings that were further elaborated by her successors, that drop already awakens something in us to develop ourselves. And so Theosophy teaches not only that there are further evolved beings in development of consciousness, but also how we can follow in their path. And how we can also climb out this cave ourselves, and we can all do this. And to understand this, let us briefly consider the last two principles on which the Theosophical view of life is based. So, we talked about boundlessness before the break. So then we will talk about cyclicity and also about this idea of fundamental identity of all living beings and self-directed evolution, because that's actually, the process we are in to get out this cave. So first, cyclicity. And we'll again take a look in the different world religions and philosophies, and there you all can discover this idea of this of cyclicity. And so in Hinduism they say the universe lives in, proceeds from, will return to Brahma. In Islam they say to Allah we belong, to Him is our return. In Christianity, in it we live and move and have our being. Taoism, it says the returning is the movement of the Tao, and in Buddhism they talk about the dewdrop that slips into the shining sea. So you can also all there see this principle of cyclicity. Well, from a more scientific point of view, we can of course recognize this in all natural processes, with the seasons, with ebb and flood, with day and night. And we can also experience it ourselves when in sleeping and waking, death and life, rise and fall of civilizations. And also life manifests cyclically. Consciousness recedes over time, has a rest period, then is drawn again to the outer world to gain more experience, and an active period begins again. And like this grandchild says to his granddad, yeah, I didn't believe in reincarnation either when I was at your age. So we do not always recognize this, because our consciousness really identifies itself so much with just only one sphere of being, and that we other spheres then fall outside of our perception. So for us something appears and disappears, but it's really something that has a continuous movement in it. Now this cyclical process is also how a cosmos is born, the way a person is born. You see at the left the remains of a supernova, a star at the end of his life that explodes, and to the right how from nebula again stars are formed. These gaseous nebulas that are the birth chamber for new stars. Well, from Eastern philosophy we can of course recognize this a lot, but it's also has also been part of Western philosophies and religions. The ancient Greeks believed in this cyclicity of life, in reincarnation, and you can also find it in early Christianity. But mainly we know it from Eastern philosophy, for instance from the Bhagavad Gita, from Hinduism. This quote, "Never was I not, neither you, nor these princes of the earth, nor will any of us ever cease to be." Never was I not, we have always been there. We are essentially immortal, and death is nothing but a great sleep or a birth on inner planes. And you can ask yourself, okay, is this also a truth that we can experience, that we can test, and we can share? Well, yes, this wisdom says, but then we must be able to consciously really experience the inner realms, And when most of us cannot do that yet, because our focus is not yet on these higher thinking aspects, where the more immortal part in us resides. But we have already also indications from science that there is something as reincarnation, and there are countless studies made from children that are remembering their former lives, that could be made, that they could match with those deceased, those passed away. And these are still exceptions according to the Theosophical teachings, because the average person, there is so many years between two lives, thousands of years, that it's really hard to make a match like that. But there are people also that are able to do so, that are able to consciously experience these inner realms, and they gave us this knowledge about these processes. So this is the second proposition, and this is not something that describes a movement just in a closed circle, but there's also some growth in it, some evolution in it, and that is what the third proposition describes, this idea of evolution, and that is actually working the same for all lives. You can already see a lot of correspondences in the small and in the large. And that idea of as above, so below, you can also find in a lot of explanations, also in world religions and philosophies. And man, know thyself. We have everything in us, all the knowledge that is in the universe. We are it. We are in essence the boundless. Those who know others are wise. Those who know themselves are enlightened. Lao Tzu said, or Jesus, the kingdom of heaven is within you. And also Zarathustra, for those who know themselves, they already know in themselves the whole. So this idea that we are a microcosm within the macrocosm, we are actually the key ourselves to all these processes in nature. And it's also interesting that we discover more and more from science also these correspondences in nature. Above a picture of the cosmic web, as they now see it, that they have discovered that all these galaxies are making connections with each other. They are clustered. They form a gigantic network. They still not have found out, but there are now also recent discoveries that there is some sort of communication between these galaxies, that they really somehow have the same identical movement, so there must be some line of communication there. And below, this is a picture of brain cells in the small, so how brain cells are connected, and we know how this works with all these electromagnetical pulses that are sent around between our brain cells. Well, so you can discover many, many more of correspondences in nature. I could have shown the picture of an atom, which is a sort of solar system in the small, or the idea of the golden ratio you can find everywhere, in our limbs, and in how flowers are growing, and etc., etc. Even the arms of spiral galaxies are also formed from the same proportion. And there are also some interesting philosophical conclusions we can draw from this idea of the fundamental identity of life. And I think a very ethical one, of course, is that actually it says that if everything has the same source, the same boundless source that we share, it's our same parent, you could say, that this idea of universal brotherhood, which is the main idea of the Theosophical Society, is really a fact. It is not something that is, very nice, beautiful idea, but it's really factual. It's part of the the texture of the cosmos, you could say. Second conclusion is that every being can only grow by using its own free will, has an own responsibility, it has everything also in itself. But it has to grow himself, has to evolve himself, so nobody can do this for you. But it also means that our destiny lies in our own hands. I think that it's also a very optimistic idea. We don't have to look anywhere else. We have all these potential energies in us to develop. And thirdly, that life has fundamental meaning in itself. We're not just evolving on our own, but it's always, everything is interconnected. We are, of course, composed of many other lives. Think of the cells that make up our body, but we are ourselves also part of bigger lives, of the planet, of the solar system. And we are always evolving with others. We cannot be separated from that. So actually, you could say the meaning of life is this shared spiritual evolution. So I hope I have given an idea about the broad perspective that Theosophy offers. It's just the tip of the veil. There's many more things to talk about from this this perspective of life. And it's interesting that if you look in the history of the Theosophical Society, you would expect that when Blavatsky introduced these ideas, that, it was very welcome, of course. This idea, okay, finally we know that there is something like a universal wisdom that can answer so many questions. So you might think that it was very welcome. Well, that certainly was the case also, but only for a very small group of people. Of course, there were also people that felt a bit of, threatened by it, because they, were a bit attached personally to what they thought was right. So you see, humanity does not step out the cave directly, but you can also see that there are many ideas that come from Theosophy that are running, you could say, as a red thread throughout the history of humanity. For instance, also people as Gandhi or Einstein, or here in the Netherlands, people like Montessori that were really inspired by Theosophy and also brought that into practice and in many fields of life. And Mondrian, for instance, in art. And that is, of course, not an argument to investigate it. That has to really be done by ourselves. But it shows a bit of the value it has and still has for our society today. So I all invite you to come and listen to our coming lectures, the coming months, to learn more about the ideas that were based also on these three basic principles, and can be applied to life and death, to disease, to whatever happens in life. All these main questions that we are all struggling with. So, are there any more questions? Was this a bit clear as a first introduction? Yes.
You talked about messengers earlier. You mentioned a few names. And so the messengers that you had there, I can think of who came after them as a messenger or who was influenced by them. You mentioned a couple of people that were influenced in their work, but are there messengers that came after Madame Blavatsky that you can call by name?
Well, the most of them that I named were preceding, or actually all of them were preceding Blavatsky. And so we recognize them as mostly the founders of world religions and philosophies. I will look for the slide. And it's not always very clear. They're not always very explicit about the source of their knowledge. Because at that time, it was also seen as sometimes a risk to be too explicit about this source, about this. So that's why they only taught it directly to their students. And that's the difference between this exoteric side of religions and the esoteric side. But you can find it that they always, every messenger always refers to his predecessors. So it's interesting to look for, and then you really have to study the most original ideas that we have from them, and not to stick too much to the way they express it, to the outside, but more the meaning of it, the heart of their doctrines. And you see, for instance, that if we take the Buddha, he refers to all these things that have been talked about in Hinduism. If we talk about Jesus, you see he refers to everything that has already been hinted at in Judaism. So they always build upon each other. And so they show really a line of this wisdom that is there. And they never say, okay, this is my wisdom. They always say, okay, I'm just a portal. I'm just, I'm just a messenger. I didn't make this up. This is just, So it's very interesting to study that from that light. And I think it can also solve a lot of the tension that is sometimes still there between these different religious streams. And luckily, more and more they are trying to understand each other and discovering that they have this common base. So, that's a good thing. Yeah. Yes?
For us, those names are very common, but in the time when they lived, it doesn't mean that they were popular.
No, yeah, that's right.
So, we look back, and we now know that they were messengers, but in the time when they lived, Lao Tzu, for instance, was hardly understood in this time.
Yeah. And all that we have of him is this few verses of the Tao Te King. Yeah. That's an important.
So does this mean that the universal wisdom evolves like we evolve the human beings in being?
Well, I think you could say that it's more or less the other way around. The universal wisdom is there, but as we progress, as we evolve, and we are making ourselves able to understand more, then more can also be given. So, and there was a time that it was the common doctrine. So, if you see it in the Secret Doctrine, there's talked about these different, how do you call it, the time frames, the yugas, that there was a time that it was just common knowledge, that was just natural. But when we evolved, we also got a little bit more selfish. By developing our thinking aspects, we became also a bit too selfish, and then used this wisdom for our own personal ends. And that was the time that when the esoteric line started. So that the wisdom had to be veiled, that they started to use metaphors and all these, even myths or fairy tales to. And if you know the symbols, you can still find the same doctrine there. But you have to know the symbols. You have to know the key, turn it around, sometimes even 7 times, Blavatsky says. So, Now, I'm talking so much that I'm forgetting your question.
Universal wisdom is not growing.
Yeah, it's not growing, right.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's there.
It's there.
It is there. And if we grow, we can awaken it in ourselves. And of course, in the long history, it is growing, but it's not growing as universal wisdom, but it's growing in the understanding of us as humanity.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
exactly, that's becoming
Yeah.
more and more,
Yeah, more and more spread out, more and more popular.
more and more consciousness.
Yes, yes.
So it lifts us to a higher level of universal wisdom
Yeah.
as united.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, in that sense, Theosophy is also very optimistic for the long future. It describes that there will be a situation when we all will master these thinking aspects, that we really will act as a unity. And we'll really take our responsibility as humanity. But of course, that is something we have to do, each of us, ourselves also. It's our responsibility. So we already have some of this knowledge, and of course, we can help each other with this. And that's why we always, in the the Theosophical Society, we always study together. We always use our different perspectives, because everyone has something to share, and it's like the blind monks. Everybody can test a bit and find out a bit and share this, and then we can get this bigger picture. Yeah. All right. Well, then if there are no questions, then we will end with the Gayatri from the Rig Veda, one of the oldest ancient universal wisdom sources there is, from the Indian tradition. And then 7 strokes of the gong and a short moment of silence, and then I have just a few messages to round off. And it is talked about the golden sun, and the source of universal wisdom in ourselves. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity which is in the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.